Every small town has something sacred that holds the community together, something that represents hope when times get hard. In St. Augustine's Hollow, that sacred symbol was a 60-year-old Virgin Mary statue that had comforted generations through their darkest moments. On a hot October afternoon, 4 grown men decided to destroy it. They poured gasoline over the beloved statue and set it on fire, laughing as the flames took hold. Parts of the statue began turning to ash and crumbling away. But then something impossible happened. The ashes started pulling back together, rebuilding the statue piece by piece. Golden light began glowing from every crack as it reformed completely. The 4 men stood frozen, watching something they couldn't understand. When the townspeople arrived later that afternoon, they found their statue not just restored, but transformed. But what happened to the men who started the fire? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. St. Augustine's Hollow had been carved into the rolling hills of Pennsylvania in 1823 by Irish immigrants seeking a place where faith could flourish alongside honest work. 200 years later, the town still carried that spirit in its weathered brick buildings, tree-lined streets, and the gentle way neighbors greeted each other by name every morning. The population had never exceeded 3,000 souls, and most folks preferred it that way. At the heart of the town square stood the Virgin Mary statue that had become as essential to daily life as the sunrise itself. Carved from Pennsylvania, limestone by Antonio Rossetti in 1963, the statue depicted Mary with her arms outstretched in welcome, her face turned skyward with an expression of profound peace. The Italian immigrant had spent 3 years crafting every fold of her robes, every gentle curve of her features, pouring his gratitude into the stone. After his young daughter recovered from what doctors had called an incurable illness, Father Miguel Santos had tended to St. Augustine's Hollow for 30 years. Arriving as a young priest fresh from seminary and growing gray in service to his adopted community. At 67, he moved with the careful dignity of a man who had buried 3 generations and baptized their children, who had counseled couples through 40-year marriages and held hands with the dying as they drew their final breaths. His small frame belied a voice that could fill the modest church without a microphone, and his dark eyes held the kind of warmth that made even the most hardened skeptics feel welcome at his table. Every morning at 6:30, Father Miguel would walk the 4 blocks from the rectory to the town square, where he would spend 15 minutes in silent prayer before the statue. He was rarely alone in this ritual. Mary Kowalski, 83 and sharp as the day she'd arrived from Poland, would kneel on her worn prayer cushion regardless of weather. Tom Bradley, the mailman, would pause during his route to cross himself and whisper a quick prayer for his son serving overseas. Even the teenagers heading to school would unconsciously slow their steps as they passed, some still making the sign of the cross their grandmothers had taught them. Martha Henley had been the town's librarian and unofficial historian for 42 years. At 72, she maintained the leather-bound town chronicle with the same meticulous care her predecessors had shown for over a century. Every significant birth, death, marriage, and event found its way into Martha's careful script, creating a living record of St. Augustine's Hollow that stretched back to its founding. She knew which families had arrived on which ships, who had fought in which wars, and exactly which prayer intentions had been offered at the statue during the town's darkest hours. The chronicle contained 13 pages, devoted entirely to Antonio Rossetti and his statue. Martha had interviewed the old sculptor extensively before his death in 1987, recording not just the technical aspects of his work, but the spiritual journey that had inspired it. According to her careful notes, Antonio had experienced vivid dreams during the carving process, dreams of future generations finding comfort in his creation. of miracles yet to unfold, of a divine purpose that extended far beyond his own gratitude. But St. Augustine's Hollow, like many small Pennsylvania towns, had faced its share of struggles in recent years. The textile mill that had employed nearly half the population had closed in 2019, sending economic ripples through every family and business. Young people left for opportunities in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, leaving behind an aging population, struggling to maintain the community their ancestors had built. The local diner changed hands twice in 3 years, and Main Street showed too. Many empty storefronts with for rent signs that had grown faded and weathered. It was against this backdrop of quiet desperation that four men had found themselves, gathering most mornings at Danny Cross's single-wide trailer on the outskirts of town. At 29, Danny was the youngest of the group, a former mill worker whose easy smile masked a growing bitterness toward the town that had, in his view, failed to provide him with the life he'd been promised. His trailer sat on a half-acre of scrubland that his grandfather had left him, surrounded by auto parts, beer cans, and the remnants of projects he'd started but never finished. Jake Morrison, 28, had been the group's unofficial leader since high school. Tall and broad-shouldered with prematurely graying hair, Jake carried himself with the swagger of someone who had once been important star quarterback, homecoming king, the boy everyone expected to make something of himself. Instead, he bounced between odd jobs for a decade, watching his former classmates leave town while he remained stuck, managing an auto repair shop that barely stayed afloat. His resentment had fermented into a bitter conviction that the world owed him more than it had delivered. Tommy Reed, 31, had perhaps fallen the furthest. Once a promising student with a partial scholarship to Penn State, he dropped out after his father's sudden death left the family farm in debt. Years of trying to save the property had drained his savings and his spirit, ending with foreclosure and a descent into alcoholism that had cost him his marriage, his relationship with his 2 young children, and what remained of his self-respect. He lived now in a basement apartment behind the abandoned hardware store, existing on unemployment benefits and whatever odd jobs he could find. Carl Benson, 26, was the quietest of the 4, a thin man with nervous hands who had never quite figured out how to fit into the world. His marriage had ended 2 years earlier when his wife discovered his gambling problem, taking their 4-year-old son to her mother's house in Harrisburg and allowing Carl only supervised weekend visits that he could rarely afford to make. He worked sporadically as a handyman, but his unreliability and growing paranoia had cost him most of his regular customers. The 4 men had found each other through a shared sense of grievance, a common belief that life had dealt them unfair hands while others prospered through luck or connections they lacked. Their morning gatherings at Danny's trailer had evolved into extended drinking sessions where they nursed their resentments and fed each other's anger with increasingly elaborate theories about why their lives had gone wrong. Into this simmering tension had arrived Sarah Chun, a 45-year-old freelance journalist who had recently moved to St. Augustine's Hollow from Philadelphia. After 20 years covering urban politics and corporate scandals, Sarah had burned out on the cynicism and corruption that seemed to define big city journalism. She'd inherited a small house from her great-aunt and decided to try a different kind of storytelling, finding the human dramas and quiet heroism that played out in America's small towns. Sarah had been immediately struck by the devotion she witnessed at the statue each morning. During her first week in town, she'd watched Father Miguel's dawn prayers, Mary Kowalski's unwavering faith, and the subtle ways the entire community seemed to orbit around this focal point of shared belief. She'd begun researching the statues, history through Martha's meticulous records, planning a feature story about how sacred spaces anchor communities during difficult times. What Sarah hadn't yet discovered was the growing resentment that festered in the trailer on the edge of town. where four men had convinced themselves that the statue represented everything hypocritical about their community. In their view, the daily prayers and rituals were empty gestures that distracted from real problems: the economic decline, the lack of opportunities, the way older residents seemed to accept poverty as God's will rather than fighting for change. Jake, in particular, had developed an almost obsessive hatred for what he called the statue crowd. He resented the way people found comfort in prayer instead of demanding action, the way Father Miguel counseled patience and acceptance instead of righteous anger. In Jake's mind, the statue had become a symbol of everything that kept St. Augustine's Hollow trapped in the past, preventing the kind of bold changes that might restore prosperity to their forgotten corner of Pennsylvania dawn as October's crisp. Mornings gave way to unseasonably warm afternoons. The tension in Danny's trailer had been building towards something none of them had quite articulated. They talked about making a statement, about forcing the town to confront reality instead of hiding behind religious platitudes. They spoke vaguely of actions that would wake people up, though none had been willing to specify exactly what such actions might entail. The morning of October 15th had started like many others, with the four men gathering around Danny's kitchen table as the sun climbed higher than usual for the season. But something in the air felt different that day, a restless energy that turned their usual complaints into something more focused and dangerous. As the hours passed and the beer cans accumulated, their conversation had gradually shifted from general grievances to specific targets, from abstract resentment to concrete plans for revenge against the symbol they blamed for their town's refusal to change. None of them could have imagined that within hours they would witness something that would challenge every assumption they held about the nature of reality itself. The sun had barely reached its peak when Jake Morrison pushed back from Danny's kitchen table, his fourth beer of the morning leaving him bold enough to voice what had been building in his mind for weeks. "I'm sick of watching this town pretend. Everything's fine," he said, his words carrying the weight of accumulated frustration. "People walking around that damn statue like it's going to pay their bills or bring back their jobs." Tommy looked up from his own beer, his bloodshot eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What are you getting at, Jake?" "I'm saying maybe it's time someone showed them how useless their precious prayers really are." Jake's voice had taken on the tone he'd used in high school when convincing his teammates to pull pranks that always seemed to go too far. "Maybe it's time we gave them something real to pray about." Danny leaned forward, interested despite himself. The trailer felt smaller with Jake's energy filling it, and the October heat streaming through the single window made the air thick and close. "You're talking about the statue." "I'm talking about waking people up." Jake stood and began pacing the narrow space between the table and the refrigerator. 3 years since the mill closed, and what has this town done? Nothing. They just keep kneeling in front of that chunk of rock, asking for miracles instead of fighting for change. Carl, who had been silent through most of the morning, finally spoke. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Jake stopped pacing and looked at each of them in turn. In the harsh light filtering through the trailer's dirty windows, his face had taken on a hardness that reminded them all of the quarterback who had once convinced an entire team to follow him into fights they couldn't win. "I'm suggesting we show them what their statue is really worth." The red gasoline can have been sitting in the corner of Danny's trailer for months, left over from a lawnmower that had long since broken down. Jake picked it up and shook it, listening to the liquid slosh inside. "Still half full," he said with grim satisfaction. "Jake, you can't be serious." Tommy's voice carried a note of alarm, though whether he was genuinely concerned or simply afraid of getting caught, none of them could have said. "Dead serious." Jake set the can down with deliberate force. "We walk into that square, douse that statue, and light it up. Let's see how much comfort their Virgin Mary provides when she's nothing." but ash and smoke. Danny found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to agree. The idea felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. When? Now. Jake's response was immediate and final. Right now, while everyone's at lunch. Quick and clean, then we're done. Carl's hands had begun their familiar nervous trembling. What if someone sees us? Who's going to see us? Half the town's at work, the other half's taking their afternoon naps. Jake picked up the gasoline. Can again, testing its weight. Besides, what are they going to do? Call the cops? Sheriff Murphy's probably asleep in his office anyway. The walk to the town square took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Jake carried the gasoline can openly, his swagger suggesting he had every right to be walking through St. Augustine's Hollow with flammable liquid on a Tuesday afternoon. The others followed at varying distances, each lost in his own thoughts about what they were about to do. The square was indeed deserted, except for a few elderly residents sitting on benches in the shade, none of whom paid particular attention to 4 young men crossing the grass toward the statue. The Virgin Mary stood as she had for 60 years, her limestone face serene and welcoming, her arms outstretched as if embracing the entire community that had found comfort in her presence. Up close, Jake could see the details that had taken Antonio Rossetti 3 years to carve, the delicate folds in Mary's robes, the gentle expression of compassion in her features, the way her hands seemed to offer blessing to anyone who approached. For a moment, something flickered in his chest that might have been doubt or even reverence. Then he unscrewed the cap on the gasoline can. You sure about this? Danny's voice was barely above a whisper. Too late to back out now. Jake began pouring gasoline over the statue's base, the sharp smell cutting through the warm afternoon air. The liquid ran down the limestone in dark streams, pooling around Mary's feet and soaking into the carved folds of her robes. Tommy watched from a few feet away, his stomach churning with a mixture of alcohol and growing anxiety. Maybe we should. Maybe. We should what? Jake's voice had turned harsh, defensive. Go back to Danny's trailer and drink ourselves unconscious while this town rots around us. No, this is happening. He emptied the rest of the gasoline over the statue's upper portions, ensuring that Mary's face and outstretched arms were thoroughly soaked. The fumes rose in visible waves, making the air shimmer around the figure that had been carved with such love and devotion 6 decades. Earlier, Carl fumbled in his pocket for the book of matches he'd grabbed from Danny's kitchen. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely tear one free from the pack. Jake, I don't. Give me those. Jake snatched the matches away and struck one in a single fluid motion. The flame seemed impossibly bright in the afternoon sunlight, a tiny point of destruction poised above all that accumulated gasoline. For a heartbeat, the 4 men stood frozen in a tableau of anticipated vandalism. Jake with the burning match, the others arranged around him like reluctant apostles. The statue rising before them with its expression of eternal compassion. Then Jake dropped the match. The gasoline ignited with a soft whoosh that quickly became a roar as flames engulfed the entire statue. Mary disappeared behind a wall of orange and yellow fire, the heat so intense that the 4 men had to step back even, as they laughed with the nervous energy of having finally done something irreversible. There's your miracle, Jake shouted over the crackling flames. Let's see her get out of this one. But their laughter died as they watched the fire begin to work on the limestone. Parts of the statue fingers, portions of the robes, even sections of Mary's face began to crumble and fall away as ash. The sight was more disturbing than any of them had anticipated, transforming their act of defiance into something that felt genuinely destructive, even evil. Tommy took another step back, his face pale. Oh God, what have we done? We've made a statement, Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. The statue was dissolving before their eyes, 60 years of craftsmanship, reducing to powder and smoke. That's when the impossible began to happen. The ashes that had fallen to the ground started to move. Not scattered by wind, there was no wind but pulling back together, defying gravity as they rose and reformed. The four men watched in growing disbelief as pieces of the statue began to reassemble themselves, limestone flowing like liquid before hardening again into recognizable shapes. What the hell? Danny's voice cracked like a teenager's. The flames continued to burn, but now they seemed to be coming from within the statue itself, golden light emerging from every crack and crevice as the limestone reformed. Mary's face reappeared. More perfect than before, her expression still serene but somehow more alive, more present. Carl stumbled backward and fell, scrambling away on his hands and knees. That's not possible. That's not possible. But it was happening. Before their eyes, the Virgin Mary statue was not just surviving the fire, it was being transformed by it. The golden light grew brighter, more intense, until it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The flames that had been meant to destroy were now illuminating every detail of the carving with supernatural clarity. Jake stood transfixed, the empty gasoline can forgotten at his feet. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced by a fear so profound it left him unable to move or speak. This was beyond his understanding, beyond anything his rational mind could process. Tommy was the first to break. "We have to get out of here," he whispered, then louder. "We have to get out of here now." One by one, they ran. Jake last of all, turning back once to see the statue standing whole and radiant, more beautiful than it had ever been, glowing with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. Behind them, the Virgin Mary continued to burn with golden fire, and for the first time in 60 years, she seemed to be truly alive. Jake Morrison's hands were still trembling when he arrived at work the next morning. The image of golden light pouring from limestone cracks burned into his memory like a brand. He'd spent the night drinking whiskey and telling himself that what he'd witnessed was some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and alcohol. But the story spreading through St. Augustine's Hollow made it impossible to maintain that comfortable delusion. By 8:30, Mel's Auto Repair was buzzing with customers who normally would have taken their business to the chain stores in the next town over. Everyone wanted to talk about the miracle, to share their theories about what had happened, to bask in the reflected glory of living in a place where the impossible had occurred. "Strangest thing I ever saw," old Pete Kowalski was telling anyone who would listen. "Mary's face was actually glowing when I walked by this morning, not reflecting light making light." Jake tried to focus on the timing belt he was replacing, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time someone mentioned the statue, his stomach lurched with a mixture of guilt and terror that he'd never experienced before. At 10:15, Mel Hutchinson called him into the office. Mel was 63 years old and had run the shop for 35 years, treating his employees more like family than hired help. The expression on his weathered face was one Jake had never seen before: disappointed, but also somehow afraid. "Jake, I got a call this morning from the Hendersons about their Buick," Mel said, settling his bulk into the chair behind his desk. "They say you charged them for parts you never installed. Told them their transmission was shot when all it needed was fluid." Jake's mouth went dry. The Henderson job had been 3 weeks ago, and he'd legitimately diagnosed a transmission problem that would have cost them $1,500 to fix. He'd recommended they trade the car in instead, saving them money. "Mel, that's not what happened. I told them." "I know what you told them," Mel interrupted. "Problem is, they took the car to Eddie's shop in Millerville yesterday, and Eddie says the transmission's fine. Never was anything wrong with it except low fluid." The room seemed to spin slightly around Jake. He remembered that job clearly, remembered testing the transmission himself, remembered the grinding sounds that indicated internal damage. "That's impossible. I checked it myself." Eddie showed them the paperwork. Full diagnostic, everything normal. Mel pulled out a manila folder and opened it. That's not all, Jake. Got 3 more calls this morning. Mrs. Patterson says you told her she needed a new radiator, but her nephew looked at it and says it just needed a flush. The Rodriguezes claim you charged them for brake pads they didn't need. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Each of those jobs had been legitimate, necessary repairs that he'd performed competently. The idea that they were suddenly being reinterpreted as fraud made no sense. Mal, you know me. I've worked here for 2 years. I've never cheated anyone. I know. Mal's voice was heavy with regret. That's what makes this so hard to understand. But I can't have customers thinking this shop is dishonest. I'm sorry, Jake, but I have to let you go. The dismissal letter that Mel handed him was already typed, dated that morning. Jake stared at it, unable to process how his life was falling apart so quickly. There has to be some mistake. I'm sorry. Mel repeated, and the genuine sadness in his voice made it worse somehow. Clean out your toolbox by the end of the day. Jake stumbled out of the office in a daze, past customers who were still discussing the miracle in animated voices. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was losing his job while half the town celebrated what they saw as divine intervention. If only they knew who was responsible for their miracle. Across town, Danny Cross was discovering that his truck, a 1998 Ford F-150 that had been running perfectly the day before, would no longer start. The engine turned over, but wouldn't catch, making a grinding sound that seemed to echo the chaos in his head. He'd already called 2 mechanics, both of whom were too busy discussing the statue to make time for his problem. Tommy Reed sat in his basement apartment, staring at the eviction notice that had been slipped under his door sometime during the night. The paper claimed he was 3 months behind on rent, which was impossible since he'd paid his landlord just 2 weeks earlier. But when he called Mrs. Shen to straighten out the confusion, she insisted that she hadn't received a payment from him since July. I have the canceled check, Tommy protested, searching frantically through his papers. I'm sorry, Tommy, but my records are very clear. If you can't bring the back rent by Friday, you'll need to find somewhere else to live. Tommy found the check register and felt his world tilt. The entries he remembered making rent payments, grocery purchases, the occasional beer run had somehow changed. In his own handwriting, the register showed money spent on things he'd never bought, payments made to creditors he'd never heard of. It was as if his financial history had been rewritten by someone else's hand. Carl Benson was having his own crisis at the county courthouse, where he'd gone to file paperwork for his scheduled weekend visit with his 4-year-old son. The clerk, a woman he'd dealt with dozens of times before, looked at him with obvious confusion. I'm sorry, Mr. Benson, but there's no custody arrangement on file under your name. That's impossible. I was here last month. Judge Williams signed the papers himself. The clerk checked their computer again, then pulled out a physical file. According to our records, your ex-wife was granted full custody with no visitation rights. The judge's notes indicate concerns about your mental stability and potential danger to the child. Carl's hands began their familiar trembling as he stared at documents that bore his name but described events he'd never experienced. Court hearings he'd never attended, psychological evaluations he'd never undergone, character witnesses who had apparently testified to his unfitness as a father by. Late afternoon, the 4 men found themselves back at Danny's trailer, drawn together by a shared sense of catastrophe they couldn't explain or understand. The golden glow of the statue was visible from Danny's front window, a constant reminder of the impossible thing they'd witnessed. This is connected, Jake said, pacing the small space like a caged animal. It has to be. None of this was happening before yesterday. You're talking about the statue, Carl said quietly. You think somehow I think we messed with something. we shouldn't have messed with," Tommy interrupted. "And now it's messing with us back." Danny stared out the window at the distant glow. "Statues don't have feelings. They don't get revenge." "That statue put itself back together after we burned it," Jake said. "So maybe we need to stop thinking about what statues normally do." Meanwhile, Sarah Chun was conducting her first interviews with witnesses to the miracle. Father Miguel had agreed to speak with her, and his account was both detailed and deeply moving. "I've served this community for 30 years, the priest told her in his quiet office behind the church. "I've seen faith sustain people through terrible losses, watched prayers provide comfort in the darkest times. But yesterday was different. Yesterday, I watched the physical world bend to accommodate the spiritual one." "What do you think it means?" Sarah asked. Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "I think it means that some things are too sacred to be destroyed, even by those who don't believe in their power. I think it means that divine justice exists, even when we can't see it working." As evening fell over St. Augustine's Hollow, the statue's golden glow grew brighter, visible now from several blocks away. Townspeople began gathering in the square, not for any organized service, but simply to witness the continued presence of something beyond their understanding. And in the trailer on the edge of town, 4 men sat in growing silence, each beginning to suspect that their act of destruction had set in motion consequences they were only beginning to comprehend. 3 days after the miracle, Tommy Reed stood outside his basement apartment with everything he owned stuffed into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. Mrs. Chun had been sympathetic but firm. The eviction notice was legal. The back rent was real according to her records, and she needed the space for a tenant who could pay reliably. "I don't understand how this happened," Tommy said for the 4th time, his voice thick with desperation and the remnants of last night's drinking. "Neither do I," Mrs. Chun replied, though her expression suggested she thought she understood perfectly. "But Mr. Reed, even if there was some mistake with the rent, there's the matter of the complaints from other tenants." Tommy stared at her blankly. "What complaints?" "The loud music at all hours, the smell of marijuana, the visitors who come and go at strange times." She consulted a small notebook. "Mrs. Patterson upstairs says you've been hosting parties that keep her awake until dawn." "I haven't had a visitor in months," Tommy protested. "I don't even own a stereo." But Mrs. Chun's notebook contained detailed records of noise complaints, police calls that had never been made, incidents that had never occurred. In her neat handwriting, Tommy's quiet desperation had been transformed into the disruptive behavior of an inconsiderate tenant who posed a threat to the building's peaceful atmosphere. As Tommy loaded his belongings into Carl's battered Honda, the only vehicle among the 4 that still functioned, he couldn't shake the feeling that reality itself was being rewritten around him. The familiar streets of St. Augustine's Hollow seemed different now, as if he were seeing them through someone else's eyes. Danny Cross was experiencing his own version of the same phenomenon. His truck, which 3 mechanics had now declared unfixable due to mysterious engine damage that seemed to worsen each time they looked at it, sat in his driveway like a monument to mechanical impossibility. But the truck was only the beginning of his problems. The unemployment benefits he'd been receiving since the mill closure had been suspended pending an investigation into alleged fraud. According to the letter from the state office, Danny had apparently been working under the table while collecting benefits, a serious violation that could result in criminal charges and demands for full repayment of everything he'd received. Over the past year, "I haven't worked anywhere," Danny told the investigator over the phone. "I've been looking for work, but there's nothing around here. Mr. Cross, we have documentation showing you've been employed by Morrison Construction for the past 8 months. Your employer has been withholding taxes and reporting your income to us regularly. Morrison Construction isn't even a real company," Danny said, though even as he spoke, he felt a chill of uncertainty. Jake's last name was Morrison, but Jake had never mentioned starting a construction business. "I have their incorporation papers." "Right here," the investigator replied. "Filed 18 months ago, listing you as a full-time employee." After hanging up, Danny called Jake to ask about Morrison Construction. Jake's response was immediate and angry. "I never filed any papers. I never started any company. And I sure as hell never hired you for anything." But when they checked online, Morrison Construction had a website, a business license, and tax records showing Danny as a regular employee with a steady income that made his unemployment claims fraudulent. The digital paper trail was so complete and convincing that Danny began to doubt his own memory of the past 8 months. Carl Benson was discovering that his problems extended far beyond custody arrangements. The supervised visitation rights he'd fought so hard to maintain had been revoked entirely based on a psychological evaluation he'd never undergone. According to the court records, a Dr. Patricia Williams had found him to be emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous to the minor child. When Carl called Dr. Williams' office, he was told that she'd been conducting court-ordered evaluations for troubled fathers for 15 years, and that his case was particularly concerning due to his history of violent behavior toward his ex-wife. "I never hit Susan," Carl protested. "I never even raised my voice to her." "Mr. Benson, I have detailed notes from our 3 sessions together. You described multiple incidents of domestic violence, expressed ongoing anger toward your ex-wife, and demonstrated clear signs of paranoid thinking." Carl hung up the phone with shaking hands. He had no memory of meeting Dr. Williams, no recollection of the session she described, no awareness of the violent thoughts she claimed he'd expressed. Yet her notes were detailed and professional, describing conversations that felt real even, though he was certain they'd never happened. Jake Morrison was dealing with consequences that extended beyond his job loss. 3 more customers had come forward with claims that he'd cheated them, stories that were detailed and convincing but described work he was certain he'd performed honestly. Worse, the state licensing board had opened an investigation into his belays certifications, claiming they'd received multiple complaints about his competence and ethics. "It's like someone's going through our lives and changing everything," Jake said as the 4 men sat around Danny's kitchen table on Friday evening, "making us look like criminals and losers." "We are losers," Tommy said quietly. He'd been sleeping in Carl's Honda for 2 nights, unable to find anyone willing to rent to him given the eviction on his record. "Maybe we always were, and we're just seeing it clearly now." "Don't start with that mystical garbage," Jake snapped. "This isn't about divine justice or cosmic karma. Someone's messing with our records, hacking into computers, bribing people to lie about us." But even as he said it, Jake knew how absurd it sounded. The scale of the conspiracy required to fabricate their collective downfall would involve dozens of people, multiple government agencies, and access to systems that no individual could possibly manipulate. Carl spoke the thought that none of them wanted to voice. What if it's not someone doing this to us? What if it's something? Through the trailer's single window, they could see the golden glow that had become a permanent feature of St. Augustine's hollow skyline. The statue was brighter tonight than it had been since the miracle, pulsing, with a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. "I heard old Mary Kowalski this morning," Danny said. She was telling Father Miguel that the statue cured her arthritis. Saw it, she touched the base and felt the pain leave her hands for the first time in 20 years. And yesterday, the Patterson boy, you know, the one with leukemia, his mom says the doctors can't find any trace of the cancer anymore. They're calling it a spontaneous remission. Jake stood abruptly, knocking over his beer can. So what? So, some people think they're getting healed while our lives fall apart? How is that fair? Maybe, Carl said slowly. Fairness isn't the point. Maybe we're being shown something. Shown what? Carl was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. What we really are, what we've always been. Maybe the statue isn't changing anything. Maybe it's just making the truth visible. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of recognition none of them wanted to acknowledge. In the distance, the golden light pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat of divine judgment that refused to be ignored. Sarah Chan was learning that the miracle had effects far beyond the healing stories that were beginning to spread through town. Her interviews with townspeople revealed a community that was experiencing a profound spiritual awakening, a renewal of faith that extended into every aspect of daily life. Crime had dropped to zero. The county sheriff reported that his department hadn't received a single call for theft, assault, or domestic disturbance since the statue's restoration. Even minor infractions like speeding tickets and parking violations had ceased entirely. "It's like the whole town is holding its breath," Sheriff Murphy told her, waiting to see what happens next. What was happening, Sarah was beginning to understand, was a demonstration of divine justice so clear and undeniable that it was transforming an entire community's understanding of how the world actually worked. Martha Henley had spent 42 years maintaining the town chronicle with methodical precision, but the leather-bound journal that Father Miguel placed on her kitchen table challenged everything she thought she knew about historical documentation. The journal belonged to Antonio Rossetti, written in fading Italian ink during the 3 years he'd spent carving the Virgin Mary statue. "I found it in the church archives," Father Miguel explained, accepting the cup of tea Martha offered with hands that trembled slightly. "Hidden behind some old donation records. I think Antonio wanted it to be discovered, but only when the time was right." Martha opened the journal carefully, her knowledge of Italian rusty but sufficient to make out the sculptor's careful script. The first entries were mundane notes about limestone quality, weather conditions that affected his work, sketches of potential designs. But as she progressed through the pages, the content became increasingly mystical. He was having visions, Martha said, looking up at Father Miguel with wonder. Dreams about the statue's future. "Keep reading," the priest encouraged. The entry dated September 15, 1963, made Martha's breath catch in her throat. In Antonio's precise handwriting, she found a description of 4 men who would someday try to destroy his creation, along with detailed accounts of what would happen to them afterward. The sculptor had seen their faces in dreams, had known their names decades before their births. "This is impossible," Martha whispered. "How could he have known?" "Perhaps, Father Miguel," said gently, "impossible isn't the right word anymore." Antonio's journal contained prophecies that extended far beyond the 4 vandals. He'd foreseen the mill's closure, the town's economic struggles, and the spiritual renewal that would follow the statue's miraculous restoration. Most remarkably, he'd written about the healing miracles with clinical precision, listing specific individuals who would be cured and the exact nature of their ailments. "Mrs. Kowalski's arthritis," Martha read aloud. "The Patterson child's blood disease. Even Sarah Chun's arrival in town. It's all here, written 60 years ago." But the journal's most disturbing revelation concerned the vandals themselves. According to Antonio's visions, their suffering was not punishment but purification, a necessary process that would prepare them for a greater purpose. The sculptor had seen their eventual redemption, their transformation from destroyers into protectors of the very thing they tried to annihilate. While Martha and Father Miguel studied the prophetic journal, Carl Benson sat in his car outside the county hospital, staring at the bottle of sleeping pills he'd purchased that morning. The prescription was legitimate. A doctor had given them to him months earlier, during his divorce proceedings, but the plan forming in his mind was anything but 50 pills should be enough, he'd calculated. Enough to stop the constant anxiety, the sleepless nights, the crushing weight of a life that seemed determined to destroy itself. His ex-wife had made it clear that he would never see his son again. His job prospects had evaporated along with his reputation. Even his few remaining friends had begun to distance themselves as word spread about his supposed psychological problems. Carl opened the bottle and poured the pills into his palm, counting them carefully. 47. Close enough. He'd driven to the hospital parking lot because he wanted to be found quickly, wanted his death to be clean and professional rather than something that would traumatize whoever discovered his body. But as he raised the pills toward his mouth, something extraordinary happened. His car radio, which had been silent since the battery died 2 weeks earlier, suddenly crackled to life. The voice that emerged was his 4-year-old son, speaking in the present tense as if the conversation were happening in real time. "Daddy, where are you? Mommy says you went away, but I know you're coming back. I made you a picture at school. It's a statue like the one in your town, but in my picture, you're standing next to it and you're smiling." Carl's hands began to shake, so violently that the pills scattered across the car's floor. The radio continued playing his son's voice-innocent observations about kindergarten, questions about when they would go fishing again, expressions of love that cut through Carl's, despair like a sword through darkness. "I told Mommy that you're not scary like she says. I know you would never hurt me because you're my daddy and daddies protect their children. When are you coming to see me?" The transmission lasted less than 5 minutes, but by the time it faded to static, Carl was sobbing with a combination of grief and inexplicable hope. He gathered the scattered pills and threw them out the car window, then sat in the gathering darkness trying to understand what had just happened to him. Danny Cross was experiencing his own moment of crisis, though his took the form of a conversation with a man who shouldn't have existed. He'd been walking through the center of town, avoiding the growing crowds of pilgrims who came to witness the statue's golden glow, when he encountered someone who introduced himself as his supervisor from Morrison Construction. "Danny, good to see you," the man said, extending his hand with the familiarity of a long-standing work relationship. "We missed you on the job site yesterday. Everything okay?" Danny stared at the stranger, middle-aged, wearing work clothes, carrying a clipboard with what appeared to be construction schedules. "I don't know who you are." "Bill Henderson, your foreman. We've been working together for 8 months. The man's expression showed genuine concern. "You called in sick Monday, but when you didn't show up Tuesday or Wednesday, we started to worry." "Morrison Construction isn't real," Danny said, though his conviction was wavering. The man seemed so certain, so detailed in his knowledge of projects and schedules that Danny supposedly knew intimately. "Danny, we're in the middle of the Patterson house renovation. You're the one who figured out how to save the original hardwood floors." Bill pulled out his phone and showed Danny photographs of a construction site, work crews, detailed progress reports. "Your signature's on half these timesheets." Danny recognized his own handwriting on the documents, remembered conversations about construction techniques that he'd apparently had but couldn't recall. It was as if an entire parallel life had been created for him, complete with memories and relationships that felt real despite being impossible. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison was discovering that his reputation for dishonesty had spread far beyond St. Augustine's Hollow. When he applied for a job at a garage in the next town, the manager looked at him with immediate recognition. "You're the guy from Mel's place," the manager said. "Word gets around about mechanics who cheat customers. We can't risk hiring someone with your reputation." "What reputation?" "Those complaints were false. Mel knows I'm honest. Mel's the one who called me. Said you were a good worker, but couldn't be trusted with customers. Sorry, but we can't take the chance." Jake left the garage in a rage that had nowhere to focus. The accusations against him seemed to be spreading through some invisible network, poisoning every opportunity before he could even present himself. But what frustrated him most was the growing suspicion that the charges were entirely false. In quiet moments, when he allowed himself to examine his conscience honestly, Jake could remember cutting corners, overcharging customers who seemed wealthy, recommending unnecessary work to people who trusted his expertise. The behavior had seemed justified at the time. Everyone did it. The shop needed the revenue. Customers expected to be taken advantage of by mechanics. But now, confronted with the accumulating evidence of his dishonesty, Jake was forced to see himself as others had always seen him. The statue hadn't fabricated his crimes. It had simply made them visible, undeniable, impossible to rationalize away. As night fell over St. Augustine's Hollow, the golden light from the statue seemed to pulse with increased intensity, as if responding to the spiritual crises unfolding throughout the community. Sarah Chun noted in her journal that the light was now visible from over 10 miles away, drawing pilgrims from across Pennsylvania and beyond. But for 4 men whose lives were unraveling in carefully orchestrated ways, the light served as a constant reminder that some forces in the universe were too powerful to fight, too persistent to ignore, and too merciful to destroy completely, even those who deserved destruction. The hospital chapel was a small, quiet space tucked away on the 3rd floor, designed more for contemplation than formal worship. Tommy Reed hadn't intended to end up there, but after 3 days of sleeping in Carl's car and 2 unsuccessful attempts to find shelter, he'd wandered into the hospital seeking warmth and had somehow found himself kneeling before a simple wooden cross. It was 2 in the morning when the breakdown finally came. The accumulated weight of his failures, the lost farm, the divorce, the children who barely remembered him, the eviction that had left him homeless crashed over him like a collapsing wall. Tommy found himself sobbing with an intensity that frightened him, his body shaking with grief he'd been suppressing for years. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the wooden cross, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was apologizing to. "I'm sorry for all of it." The response came not as a voice, but as a presence, a sense of being heard and understood that penetrated deeper than any spoken words could have reached. For the first time since his father's death, Tommy felt genuinely forgiven, not excused or overlooked, but forgiven in a way that acknowledged his sins while refusing to let them define his worth. When he finally stopped crying, Tommy realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The crushing weight of self-hatred that had driven him to alcohol and despair had been replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: hope. He spent the rest of the night in the chapel, not praying in any formal sense, but simply sitting in the presence of whatever force had touched him. By dawn, Tommy had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He was going to face what he'd done, accept responsibility for his role in the vandalism, and find a way to make amends. Danny Cross was undergoing his own transformation, though it came through a conversation with a woman who claimed to be his daughter. He'd been walking through the parking lot of the defunct mill when a girl of about 16 approached him with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "Dad, I've been looking for you," she said, her voice carrying genuine affection. "Mom said you'd probably be here." Danny stared at her in confusion. "I think you have me confused with someone else. Danny Cross, right? You worked here before the mill closed." The girl pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph of the 2 of them together, both smiling at the camera. This was last Christmas. Danny had no memory of the photograph, no recollection of this young woman who seemed to know him intimately. But as she continued talking about school, about her job at the local grocery store, about plans for college that she was hoping he would help finance, he began to feel a strange sense of recognition. "You taught me how to change a tire in this parking lot," she said, gesturing toward the empty space where the mill's loading docks had once stood. "Remember? You said every person should know how to take care of themselves." The memory surfaced slowly, like something rising from deep water. Danny could suddenly recall that afternoon, the pride he'd felt in teaching practical skills to a young person, the satisfaction of being useful and respected. But the memory felt different now, weighted with significance he hadn't recognized. At the time, "Sarah, your name is Sarah," he said suddenly, the knowledge arriving without explanation. "Of course it's Sarah." She hugged him with the easy affection of family. "Dad, are you okay? You seem confused." As they talked, Danny began to understand that this relationship, whatever its nature, represented something he'd lost without realizing it. The connection with another person who valued him, who saw potential in him, who believed he was capable of being better than he'd allowed himself to become. Carl Benson was experiencing a very different kind of revelation. After his encounter with his son's voice on the radio, he'd driven to his ex-wife's neighborhood and parked across the street from her house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy he'd been forbidden to see. What he witnessed instead was a conversation between his ex-wife Susan and her new boyfriend that changed his understanding of everything that had happened to him. Through the open kitchen window, he could hear them discussing the custody case with a casualness that suggested they'd manipulated the proceedings deliberately. "The court papers were perfect," the boyfriend was saying, "making it look like Carl was violent, unstable. The judge never questioned any of it." "I still feel guilty sometimes," Susan replied. "He was never actually dangerous. Weak, unreliable, but not dangerous. You did what you had to do to protect your son. Carl was a loser who would have dragged the kid down with him." Carl listened with growing amazement as they discussed forged documents, bribed witnesses, and manufactured evidence that had destroyed his relationship with his child. But instead of feeling angry, he found himself experiencing something unexpected: gratitude. Because listening to their casual cruelty, Carl realized that he had been weak and unreliable. He had been a loser who would have dragged his son down with him. The lies they'd told about his character contained enough truth to be devastating, and the fact that they'd needed to fabricate evidence didn't change the underlying reality of who he'd become. For the first time in months, Carl felt something other than self-pity. He felt determination, not to fight the custody ruling or expose their manipulation, but to become the kind of man who deserved to be in his son's life. Jake Morrison was the last to experience anything resembling enlightenment, and his came through a confrontation with Father Miguel that he'd been avoiding for weeks. The priest had been trying to speak with all four vandals, offering counseling and spiritual guidance, but Jake had consistently refused. On this particular evening, however, Father Miguel appeared at Danny's trailer uninvited, carrying a thermos of coffee and an expression of gentle persistence that made refusing him seem petty. "I'm not here to judge you," the priest said, settling into one of the plastic chairs that served as Danny's outdoor furniture. "I'm here because I've seen what happens when people try to carry guilt alone." "I'm not carrying anything," Jake said, though his defensive tone suggested otherwise. "And I don't need counseling from someone who thinks a statue can perform miracles." "The statue didn't perform miracles," Father Miguel replied calmly. "God performed miracles. The statue was simply the vessel he chose to use." "Right, and I suppose God is punishing us for what we did. Is that what you think is happening?" Jake gestured at his circumstances: unemployed, unemployable, facing potential criminal charges for fraud he swore he hadn't committed. "What else would you call it?" Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee while he considered his response. "I'd call it an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" "To become who you were meant to be instead of who you've settled for being." The words hit Jake with unexpected force, because buried beneath his anger and defensiveness, he knew that Father Miguel was right. The man he'd become, bitter, dishonest, consumed with resentment, wasn't the man he'd intended to be. Somewhere along the way, he'd made choices that had led him away from his better self, and now he was being forced to confront the consequences. What if it's too late? Jake asked, the question emerging from some part of him he'd kept hidden for years. "It's never too late," Father Miguel said with quiet conviction. "That's the whole point of grace. It's never too late to choose differently." As the priest left that evening, Jake found himself standing alone in Danny's yard, staring at the golden glow that dominated St. Augustine's Hollow skyline. For the first time since the vandalism, he allowed himself to really see the statue, not as a symbol of everything he resented, but as evidence of something larger and more mysterious than his own limited understanding. The light pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat of divine patience that refused to give up on anyone, no matter how far they'd fallen. The discovery came during what should have been routine maintenance work on the statue's base. The golden glow had begun to attract so many pilgrims that the town council had voted to install better lighting and security around the square, which required examining the statue's foundation for structural integrity. Father Miguel watched nervously as the work crew carefully removed the limestone blocks that formed the base, afraid that any disturbance might somehow damage the miraculous restoration. But when the workers lifted the cornerstone, piece that Antonio Rossetti had set in place 60 years earlier, they found something that no one had expected. Hidden in a waterproof container was a sealed envelope bearing Antonio's distinctive handwriting. The words, "To be opened when the fire comes," were written across the front in faded blue ink, and below it, a date that made Father Miguel's hands tremble. October 15th, 2024. Martha. Hanley arrived within minutes of Father Miguel's call, bringing her translation skills and her growing understanding of Antonio's prophetic visions. Together, they opened the envelope in the privacy of the church office, away from the crowds that had gathered to watch the restoration work. The letter was written in Italian, but unlike the journal entries Martha had been translating, this document was meant to be understood clearly and completely. Antonio had written it with the precision of someone delivering final instructions, someone who knew exactly what would happen and when. "My dear friends who will read this letter in the time of fire," Martha translated aloud, her voice growing steadier as she worked through the formal Italian phrases. "I write to you from the year 1963, but I see you clearly in the year 2024. I know the faces of the four men who will try to destroy what I have created, and I know the hearts that drive them to such desperation." Father Miguel leaned forward, hardly breathing as Martha continued. "The statue that stands in your square is no ordinary carving. When my daughter recovered from her illness, I was visited by an angel who showed me visions of the future. I was instructed to create not just a statue, but a vessel, a container for a fragment of the true cross that had been lost for centuries and found again by God's providence." Martha paused, looking up at Father Miguel with wonder. "He's saying, there's actually a piece of the original cross inside the statue. Keep reading," the priest whispered. "The wood was small, no larger than a coin, but its power is infinite. I was shown how to embed it within the limestone in such a way that it would remain hidden until the time of testing came. The fire you have witnessed was not destruction, but purification, the moment when the wood's true nature could finally be revealed." The letter went on to describe the four vandals with unsettling accuracy. Antonio had seen Jake's bitterness, Tommy's despair, Danny's aimlessness, and Carl's weakness decades before their births. But more remarkably, he'd understood that their attack on the statue was not random vandalism, but a necessary part of a divine plan. "These four souls have been chosen for a great work," Martha read, "though they do not yet understand their calling. Their destruction of my statue will release the power that has been waiting within it. But more importantly, their own destruction, the collapse of their false selves, will prepare them to become something new." Father Miguel felt his breath catch as Martha continued translating. "The suffering they experience is not punishment, but purification. Each man carries within him great potential for good, but that potential has been buried under layers of selfishness, fear, and despair. The fire they light will burn away everything false in their lives, leaving only what is true and worthy." The most startling revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs. Antonio had not only foreseen the vandalism and its consequences, he'd been instructed to create a specific path for the four men's redemption. The letter contained detailed instructions for how they could find forgiveness and purpose, but it also contained a warning. The choice must be freely made, Martha translated. Divine grace offers the opportunity for transformation, but it cannot force acceptance. Each man must decide whether to embrace the new life being offered or to cling to the old life that is already dying. According to Antonio's letter, the four vandals had until the first anniversary of their crime to make this choice. If they accepted the path to redemption, they would become guardians of the statue and servants of the community they had tried to harm. If they refused, the consequences of their actions would continue to compound until they destroyed them completely. But how could he have known all this? Father Miguel asked. How could anyone foresee the future with such precision? Martha turned to the letter's final page, where Antonio had included a detailed explanation of his supernatural experience. After his daughter's healing, he'd been granted visions not just of future events, but of the spiritual reality underlying those events. He'd seen the cosmic struggle between good and evil playing out in the lives of ordinary people, and he'd understood his role in that struggle. I am only a tool, Martha read from Antonio's words. The statue is only a vessel. The true power belongs to the one who created all things and who refuses to abandon even the most lost of his children. The letter concluded with specific instructions for Father Miguel and Martha. They were to share the letter's contents with Sarah Chun, whose book about the miracle would carry the story to a wider world. They were also to approach the four vandals directly, offering them the choice that Antonio had foreseen. But we must remember, the letter warned, the redemption cannot be imposed. It must be chosen. Our role is only to make the choice clear, not to force the decision. As Martha finished the translation, both she and Father Miguel sat in silence, overwhelmed by the implications of what they'd discovered. The miracle they'd witnessed was not a spontaneous divine intervention, but part of a plan that had been set in motion 60 years earlier by a humble sculptor who had been granted an extraordinary vision of divine mercy. Sarah Chun arrived that evening to read the letter for herself, her journalist's skepticism gradually giving way to amazement as she absorbed the document's prophetic accuracy. Every detail of the past month had been predicted with supernatural precision, from the specific date of the vandalism to the exact nature of the consequences each man would face. This changes everything, Sarah said finally. This isn't just a story about a miracle. This is a story about divine justice working through human choice, about the possibility of redemption, even for those who seem irredeemable. The letter also explained phenomena that had puzzled everyone involved in the story. The strange coincidences, the manufactured evidence, the mysterious transformations of records and documents, all of it was part of a divine intervention designed to strip away the false structures the four men had built around their lives. But the most remarkable aspect of Antonio's letter was its tone of compassion. Even as it described the vandals' crimes and the necessity of their punishment, it spoke of them with the tenderness of a father describing wayward children. Their destruction of the statue was seen not as an unforgivable sin, but as a cry for help that had finally been heard. Tomorrow, Father Miguel said as they prepared to leave the church, we begin the most difficult part of this entire experience. We offer these four men the choice between redemption and destruction, knowing that we cannot make the choice for them. The golden light pulsed steadily outside the church windows, casting everything in a warm glow that seemed to promise that divine love was patient enough to wait for even the most stubborn hearts to open. The Sunday morning when Tommy Reed walked into St. Mary's Church during Mass marked the beginning of the most profound week in St. Augustine's Hollow's history. He appeared at the back of the church during Father Miguel's homily, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in Carl's car, his face gaunt from days of barely eating, but his eyes carrying a clarity that hadn't been there since before his father's death. Father Miguel paused mid-sentence when he saw Tommy, not from surprise, but from recognition. This was the moment Antonio's letter had prepared him for, the beginning of the choice that would determine not just Tommy's fate, but the spiritual direction of the entire community. Tommy walked slowly down the center aisle, past neighbors who had known him since childhood, past former classmates who had watched his descent into alcoholism and despair. When he reached the front of the church, he turned to face the congregation rather than the altar. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary. "Something I should have said weeks ago." Father Miguel stepped aside, understanding that this confession needed to be public, witnessed by the community that had been affected by the vandalism. "My name is Tommy Reed, and I was one of the 4 men who burned the Virgin Mary statue." The words fell into absolute silence, broken only by the soft intake of breath from those who had suspected but never known for certain. "We thought we were making a statement about hypocrisy and false hope. We thought we were showing you how powerless your faith really was." Tommy's voice began to shake, but he continued. "Instead, we learned that some things are too sacred to be destroyed, even by people too broken to recognize their own need for healing. I've spent the last month watching my life fall apart, and I finally understand that it needed to fall apart. The man I was couldn't be fixed. He had to be destroyed so something better could take his place." The congregation sat in stunned silence as Tommy described his spiritual awakening in the hospital chapel, his growing understanding of his own failures, and his decision to accept responsibility for his actions, regardless of the consequences. "I don't expect forgiveness," he concluded. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that what happened to your statue, the miracle you witnessed, it changed me too. Maybe that was the point all along." As Tommy returned to his seat, Father Miguel felt the weight of Antonio's prophecy settling around them all. The first of the 4 had made his choice, publicly acknowledging his crime and expressing genuine repentance. But 3 others remained, and their decisions would be more difficult. Danny Cross had been listening to the Mass from the church parking lot, sitting in Carl's Honda with the windows down, afraid to enter but unable to drive away. When Tommy's confession reached him through the open doors, Danny felt something break open inside his chest. A wall of pride and stubborn independence that had been holding back a flood of accumulated grief. After the service ended, Danny approached Father Miguel with the hesitant steps of someone walking toward his own execution. "I was there too," he said simply. "I helped burn the statue." Father Miguel nodded with the gentle acceptance of someone who had been expecting this moment. "I know. Would you like to talk?" They spent the afternoon in the priest's study, Danny gradually revealing the anger and hopelessness that had driven him to participate in the vandalism. But as he talked, he began to understand that his real crime hadn't been setting fire to limestone and mortar. It had been setting fire to his own potential, destroying his capacity for hope and growth through years of bitterness and self-pity. "What?" Tommy said about needing to be destroyed so something better could take its place. Danny said as the conversation drew to a close, "I think I understand what he meant." "And what do you understand?" "That the man I've been isn't worth saving. But maybe there's still time to become someone who is." Carl Benson heard about Tommy's confession through the network of gossip that connected every household in St. Augustine's Hollow within hours of any significant event. He was sitting in his car outside his ex-wife's house again, not stalking but simply trying to work up the courage to knock on the door and ask for a chance to explain himself. The news hit him like a physical blow. If Tommy was confessing publicly, if Danny was talking to Father Miguel, then the truth about all 4 of them would soon be common knowledge. Carl's first instinct was to flee, to drive as far from St. Augustine's Hollow as his car would take him and start over somewhere else. But as he sat there wrestling with his options, Carl realized that running away would only prove that his ex-wife and her boyfriend had been right about him. He was weak, unreliable, a man who abandoned his responsibilities when they became difficult. If he fled now, he would spend the rest of his life knowing that he'd failed the ultimate test of character. Instead, Carl walked up to Susan's front door and knocked. The conversation that followed was brutal in its honesty. Carl admitted his role in the vandalism, acknowledged his history of poor decisions, and accepted responsibility for the ways his weakness had damaged their family. But he also told Susan about his son's voice on the radio, about the growing conviction that he could become better than he'd been, about his determination to earn back the right to be a father. "I don't expect you to trust me immediately," Carl said as their conversation concluded. "I haven't given you any reason to trust me, but I'm asking for the chance to prove that I can change." Susan's response was cautious but not entirely dismissive. "I'll think about it," she said. "But Carl, if you're serious about this, you need to get help. Real help, not just good intentions." "I know," Carl replied. "Father Miguel is expecting me tomorrow morning." Jake Morrison was the last to learn about the confessions spreading through town, and his reaction was immediate and furious. He stormed into Danny's trailer that evening to find Tommy and Danny sitting at the kitchen table with expressions of calm determination that made Jake want to hit something. "Are you both completely insane?" Jake demanded. "Do you have any idea what's going to happen when this gets out? Criminal charges, lawsuits, jail time. It's already getting out," Tommy replied quietly. "Half the town knows by now. Then we need to get our stories straight. We need lawyers. We need to coordinate our defense." "Jake," Danny interrupted. "There is no defense. We did it. We burned the statue, and everyone knows it. So what? So we just confess and hope they go easy on us? That's not how the world works." Tommy and Danny exchanged a look that carried the weight of shared understanding. "Maybe," Tommy said. "That's exactly how the world works, and we just never noticed before." Jake stared at his friend's former friends. He realized, because the men sitting across from him were no longer the bitter, resentful people he'd shared his grievances with for months. They had become something else, something he didn't recognize and couldn't relate to. "You're making a mistake," Jake said finally. "Both of you are making a terrible mistake." "Maybe," Danny agreed. "But it feels like the first right thing I've done in years." After Jake left, Tommy and Danny sat in comfortable silence, watching. The golden glow pulsed steadily through the trailer's window. Tomorrow would bring consequences they couldn't predict, but for the first time in months, both men felt genuinely peaceful about their choices. Sarah Chun spent that evening interviewing townspeople about their reactions to Tommy's confession and the growing revelation about the other vandals' identities. What she discovered was a community grappling with complex feelings about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. "I'm angry," admitted Mrs. Patterson, whose grandson had been healed of leukemia through the statue's intercession. "Those men tried to destroy something sacred, something that brought healing to my family. But I don't know how to explain it. I'm moved by the courage it took for Tommy to confess publicly." Sheriff Murphy was dealing with the practical implications of the confessions. Technically, they could be charged with destruction of public property, maybe even hate crimes, he told Sarah. But the statue wasn't actually destroyed, and the community seems more interested in healing than prosecution. The most remarkable response came from Mary Kowalski, the elderly Polish woman whose arthritis had been cured by touching the statues. "Base. Those boys were hurting," she said, with the wisdom of someone who had lived through wars and depressions and personal tragedies. "Hurt people do terrible things sometimes. But if our statue can heal bodies, maybe it can heal hearts too." As Tuesday night gave way to Wednesday morning, St. Augustine's Hollow found itself at a crossroads. 3 of the 4 vandals had chosen the path of confession and repentance, while the fourth remained defiant and isolated. The community was discovering that witnessing a miracle was easier than deciding how to respond to it. Father Miguel spent the night in prayer before the statue, asking for wisdom to guide his flock through the difficult days ahead. The golden light seemed especially bright that night, as if responding to his need for divine guidance. In his apartment behind the abandoned hardware store, Tommy Reed slept peacefully for the first time in months. Across town, Danny Cross and Carl Benson were experiencing similar rest, the deep sleep of men who had finally stopped running from themselves. But Jake Morrison lay awake in his rented room above the tavern, staring at the ceiling and planning his escape from a town that seemed determined to forgive the unforgivable. He had less than 24 hours to decide whether to join his former friends in their surrender or to fight the forces that seemed arrayed against him. The choice Antonio Rossetti had foreseen 60 years earlier was finally at hand. Jake Morrison arrived at the town square just after midnight on Wednesday, carrying a crowbar he'd stolen from the construction site where he'd once worked. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, not from its physical weight, but from the finality of what he intended to do with it. If confession and repentance were the paths his former friends had chosen, then complete destruction would be his answer. Statue stood exactly as it had since the miraculous restoration, bathed in golden light that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Pilgrims had been coming all day to witness the phenomenon, leaving flowers and prayer cards around the base. But now the square was empty, except for Jake and his desperate intentions. He circled the statue slowly, studying its surface for weaknesses, for places where repeated blows might accomplish what fire had failed to achieve. The limestone looked solid, unmarked by the flames that had consumed it weeks earlier. But Jake had spent enough time working with tools to know that everything could be broken if you hit it hard enough and often enough. You want to destroy something that can't be destroyed, a voice said behind him. Jake spun around to find Tommy Reed approaching from the direction of the church, his footsteps echoing softly on the concrete walkway. Behind him came Danny Cross and Carl Benson, moving with the careful deliberation of men who had made peace with difficult decisions. "What are you doing here?" Jake demanded, raising the crowbar defensively. "We knew you'd come," Danny said quietly. "We used to know you pretty well, remember?" "Used to," Jake repeated with bitter emphasis. "Before you all lost your minds and decided to play saints." Tommy stepped closer, his hands visible and empty, his expression carrying the kind of calm that comes from having faced the worst truth about yourself and survived it. "We're not saints, Jake. We're just tired of being angry all the time." "Anger is all we have left," Jake shot back. "Anger is what tells us we deserve better than this pathetic excuse for a life." "No," Carl said, speaking for the first time since arriving. "Anger is what kept us from seeing that we already had better. We just threw it away." Jake laughed harshly. "Right. Like your son, who you'll never see again. Like Tommy's farm that's gone forever. Like Danny's job that doesn't exist anymore. We lost everything worth having, and you want to pretend that's somehow a gift?" "We lost everything we thought we wanted," Tommy corrected. "But Jake, what if what we thought we wanted was killing us?" Jake raised the crowbar and took a step toward the statue. "I'm not listening to any more of this mystical garbage. I came here to finish what we started." He swung the heavy iron bar with all his strength, aiming for the statue's base, where the limestone looked most vulnerable. The impact should have sent shock waves through his arms, should have produced the satisfying sound of stone cracking under force. Instead, the crowbar passed through the statue as if it were made of light rather than solid matter. Jake stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the complete absence of resistance. He spun around and swung again, this time targeting the statue's face. Once again, the crowbar encountered nothing, passing harmlessly through limestone that appeared solid but offered no more substance than air. "What the hell?" Jake backed away staring at the statue in growing panic. "You can't destroy something that was never really physical to begin with," Danny said. "We tried to burn stone and mortar, but what we actually attacked was something much bigger than that." Jake swung the crowbar wildly now, striking at the statue again and again with increasing desperation. Each blow passed harmlessly through the glowing limestone, accomplishing nothing except to exhaust him and heighten his panic. "This is impossible," he gasped, dropping the crowbar and stumbling backward. "This is all impossible." But as Jake stood there panting, something extraordinary began to happen. The statue's golden light intensified, and suddenly Jake could really see, what he had been trying to destroy. Not a carved piece of limestone, but a repository of hope, faith, and love that had sustained his community for 60 years. Not a symbol of hypocrisy and false comfort, but a focal point for the best impulses of human nature. And with that vision came another one, even more devastating. Jake saw himself as he truly was, not a victim of unfair circumstances, but a man who had chosen bitterness over growth, resentment over responsibility, destruction over creation. Every lost job, every failed relationship, every missed opportunity could be traced back to decisions he had made, attitudes he had chosen to nurture, potential he had deliberately wasted. The weight of this recognition drove Jake to his knees. For the first time since childhood, he began to cry not with frustration or self-pity, but with genuine grief for the man he might have been if he had made different choices. Tommy, Danny, and Carl surrounded him, not to restrain or judge, but to offer the support they had found in each other. In that moment, the four men who had once bonded over shared resentment found themselves united by something far more powerful: the recognition that redemption was possible, even for those who had fallen the furthest. As Jake knelt in the shadow of the statue he had tried so desperately to destroy, golden tears began to fall from the Virgin Mary's eyes. The luminous droplets caught the light as they descended, each one seeming to carry its own inner radiance. As they touched the ground around the four men, Tommy was the first to notice the phenomenon. "Look," he whispered, pointing upward at the statue's face. The tears flowed steadily but gently, not with the violence of a storm, but with the patient persistence of a spring that has waited years to break through to the surface. Where they touched the concrete, small flowers began to bloom, not planted there, not growing from any visible seed, but simply manifesting as if the tears themselves contained the essence of life. Carl reached out tentatively and let one of the golden tears fall into his palm. The moment it touched his skin, he felt a warmth that penetrated deeper than his flesh, reaching into the wounded places of his heart where shame and failure had taken root. The tears seemed to dissolve those dark places, replacing them with something he had almost forgotten existed: the capacity to hope. Danny caught tears in both hands, bringing them to his face and feeling years of accumulated bitterness wash away like dust in the rain. The anger that had sustained him through months of unemployment and disappointment simply evaporated, leaving behind a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced since he was young and still believed in his own potential. Jake remained on his knees, tears streaming down his face as the golden droplets from above mingled with his own grief. When one of the luminous tears touched his forehead, he experienced something that transcended his previous understanding of reality. For just a moment, he saw himself through divine eyes, not as the failure he believed himself to be, but as a beloved child who had lost his way and was finally ready to come home. The physical wounds that had accumulated over months of self-destructive behavior began to heal. The cuts on Jake's hands from his construction work sealed themselves. The chronic back pain that had plagued Danny since his mill days simply disappeared. Carl's nervous trembling stopped for the first time in years. Tommy felt the fog of depression that had clouded his thinking lift completely, leaving him with a mental clarity he hadn't experienced since before his father's death. But the healing went deeper than physical restoration. The golden tears seemed to reach into their memories, not erasing the pain they had caused or experienced, but transforming it into something that could strengthen rather than destroy. Jake suddenly understood that every job he had lost, every relationship he had damaged, every opportunity he had wasted had been preparing him for this moment, the chance to choose genuine transformation over comfortable self-pity. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was addressing. "I'm sorry for all of it." The response came not as words, but as a presence that enveloped all four men, a sense of being completely known and completely forgiven that left them speechless with wonder. They understood, without needing explanation, that their crimes against the statue had been both real and necessary, real enough to require genuine repentance, but necessary as the catalyst for the spiritual awakening they were experiencing. "Father." Miguel appeared at the edge of the square, drawn by the intensifying light that was now visible from blocks away. Behind him came Martha Henley, Sarah Chun, and a growing number of townspeople who had been awakened by what could only be described as a spiritual summons, an irresistible sense that something extraordinary was happening at the heart of their community. They arrived to find the four vandals standing together in a circle around the statue, their faces radiant with the same golden light that flowed from the Virgin Mary's eyes. The transformation was visible not just in their expressions, but in their very posture. The shame and defensiveness that had characterized them for months had been replaced by a dignity that seemed to emanate from within. "We want to confess," Jake said as Father Miguel approached. "All of us together, publicly. We want the whole town to know what we did and what we're going to do to make it right." Father Miguel nodded, understanding that this was the moment Antonio Rossetti had foreseen. 60 years earlier, the choice had been made, the transformation had begun, and the real work of redemption could finally start. Sarah Chun documented everything with the careful attention of someone who knew she was witnessing history. The golden tears continued to fall, each droplet creating new flowers until the entire base of the statue was surrounded by a garden that had not existed an hour earlier. The light grew brighter still, visible now from miles away and drawing pilgrims, who would arrive in the morning to find a community forever changed by what they had witnessed. As the first rays of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the four men who had tried to destroy their town's most sacred symbol found themselves kneeling before it in genuine worship. Their hearts finally opened to the grace that had been waiting patiently for them to accept it. The miracle of the statues restoration had been remarkable, but the miracle of four broken men choosing redemption over destruction would prove to be the true transformation that Antonio Rossetti had carved into stone 60 years earlier. 6 months after the Night of Golden Tears, St. Augustine's Hollow had become a different place entirely. The transformation wasn't dramatic or obvious to casual visitors, but residents could feel it in the quality of conversations, in the way neighbors looked out for each other, in the shared sense that their community had been blessed with a second chance at something precious. Tommy Reed arrived at the town square every morning at sunrise, carrying the tools and supplies he needed for his volunteer work maintaining the gardens that had sprouted around the statue's base. The flowers that had bloomed from the golden tears required no special care. They seemed to thrive regardless of weather or season. But Tommy had expanded the plantings to include vegetables that he distributed freely to elderly residents and families struggling with grocery bills. The work gave him a peace he had never found in farming his family's land. There was something sacred about tending plants that grew in soil blessed by divine tears. Something healing about providing for others without expectation of return. His own needs were simple now, a small apartment above the bakery, meals shared with friends, the satisfaction of useful labor performed with love. His children had begun visiting him on weekends. Tentative at first, but gradually warming to the father who had emerged from the wreckage of the man they remembered. His ex-wife remained cautious, but she could see the change in him, could recognize that his sobriety was built on something more solid than willpower or good intentions. Danny Cross had discovered an unexpected calling as a community organizer, using skills he had developed during his mill days. He coordinated volunteer efforts throughout St. Augustine's Hollow, matching people who needed help with neighbors willing to provide it. His free food delivery service had evolved into a comprehensive support network that ensured no one in the community faced hardship alone. The unemployment fraud charges against him had mysteriously disappeared, along with all evidence that Morrison Construction had ever existed. Danny chose not to question this development too closely, accepting it as part of the larger grace that had transformed his life. Instead, he focused on building something real and lasting, relationships based on service rather than self-interest. His truck had been repaired by mechanics who could find nothing wrong with it, as if the mysterious mechanical failures had simply reversed themselves. Danny rarely drove it now except for deliveries, preferring to walk through the town where he had found his purpose. Carl Benson had been granted supervised visitation with his son, then weekend custody, and finally a shared arrangement that acknowledged his transformation into a reliable and loving father. The process had required months of counseling, parenting classes, and careful supervision. But Carl had embraced every requirement with the gratitude of someone who knew he was receiving far more than he deserved. His work as a handyman had expanded into a small business that specialized in helping elderly residents maintain their homes safely and affordably. Carl's attention to detail and newfound reliability had made him one of the most trusted service providers in the community. But more importantly, the work connected him daily with people who valued his skills and character. The psychological evaluation that had cost him custody had been mysteriously expunged from court records, replaced by reports that described a man working diligently to overcome his problems and build a stable life for his child. Carl suspected divine intervention, but chose to focus on proving worthy of whatever grace had been extended to him. Jake Morrison had perhaps traveled the furthest from his starting point. The bitter anger that had defined him for years had been replaced by a quiet determination to become useful rather than important. He worked now as an assistant to Father Miguel, helping with church maintenance, organizing community events, and providing practical support to families in crisis. His mechanical skills had found new purpose in a volunteer program that repaired, donated vehicles for single mothers and elderly residents who couldn't afford reliable transportation. Jake had discovered that fixing things for people who genuinely needed help provided a satisfaction that working for profit had never delivered. The fraud charges against him had been dropped when several customers stepped forward to acknowledge that their complaints had been based on misunderstandings rather than actual dishonesty. Jake suspected that divine justice worked both ways, protecting the innocent as well as punishing the guilty. But he was more interested in moving forward than in understanding exactly how his vindication had occurred. The four men met every Tuesday evening at Danny's trailer, which had become an unofficial gathering place for anyone in the community dealing with addiction, depression, or spiritual crisis. Their shared experience of breakdown and redemption had given them unique insight into the process of transformation, and they offered support to others with the patience of people who understood how difficult it was to change. Father Miguel often joined these gatherings, marveling at how four men who had once embodied despair and resentment had become pillars of hope and service. The community service pledge they had signed committed them to maintaining the statue and serving the town for the rest of their lives. But Miguel knew the document was unnecessary. Their service flowed from genuine love rather than legal obligation. Sarah Chun's book about the miracle had become a bestseller, drawing positive attention to St. Augustine's Hollow and providing the economic boost the community needed to recover from the mill's closure. Spiritual tourism had brought new businesses, new residents, and new opportunities while preserving the town's essential character. But the book's most important impact was the message it carried to a wider world: that divine justice exists not to destroy but to redeem, that grace is available even to those who seem beyond hope, and that authentic transformation is possible for anyone willing to surrender their false self to discover their true purpose. Martha Henley had added a final chapter to the Town Chronicle, documenting not just the miracle of the statue's restoration, but the deeper miracle of four men choosing to become who they were meant to be. She wrote with the satisfaction of a historian who had witnessed the kind of transformation that validates faith in human potential. As evening settled over St. Augustine's Hollow on this particular Tuesday, the four men who had once tried to destroy their community's most sacred symbols sat together in comfortable friendship, sharing a quiet meal and planning their work for the week ahead. Through the trailer's window, they could see the statue's golden glow pulsing steadily in the distance, a constant reminder that some things in the universe are too sacred to be destroyed and too merciful to abandon anyone, no matter how far they have fallen. The light continued to shine, welcoming pilgrims and residents alike with the promise that redemption is always possible for those who choose to accept it.